Welcome to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Established in 2016, the Fintech Times is a global multimedia news outlet centered around the world's first leading fintech newspaper. We report on the latest and brightest ideas from the fintech world. Follow the conversation using hashtag TFD News and Views and follow us at the Fintech Times. Hello, and welcome back to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. We are down a man this week, but that's okay, because me and Tom are here all ready to talk about fintech. So Tom, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing very well. I don't know what's going on. Last week you abandoned us. This week Francis is poorly, so he's abandoned us. It's it's a bit sad. We've got to wait a while to get the gang back together. But
I know.
I'm excited for what we've got to come. We've got some good articles on the way, and it's just been a busy week since we last recorded. I feel like there's been a lot going on, and things are really starting to ramp up in the fintech event space. And,
yeah, of course. I mean, you were at Money Live yesterday, right?
Yes, we were at Money Live, visiting all the different panels. The day after our last recording session, I went to the London Stock Exchange for Fintech Wales market opening ceremony. So, yeah, we've been cramming a lot in at the moment, and we've got more to come in the next couple of weeks as well. So, yeah, I think it's going to be an exciting time for us.
Amazing stuff. So anyway, on to the podcast. What are we going to talk about today? What's your article?
This week, I'm going to be covering some worrying new findings about loan applications in the UK.
Awesome. And I'm going to be talking about generative AI in banks and how they're kind of falling behind a little bit. But I will let you go first this week because as you say, I was off last week, so I'm a little out of practice. So why don't you take it away?
I'll do my best. So, as we know, like the access to finance and access to credit are quickly becoming some of the biggest topics in the world of finance. In fact, they probably already are over the last couple of years. And given the economic situation that the UK finds itself in now, people are basically just finding it harder and harder to access credit products and get their loans approved. And I'm going to be talking about new research from Tink, the payment services provider, which has revealed that 78% of 18 to 34-year-olds have had a loan application rejected. And their new report basically covers, some of the struggles that young Brits are having, when trying to access credit and finance. And when these people, young Brits, asked why they had been disqualified from their loans, 12% were told they didn't have enough credit history to qualify, while 11% were rejected because they were just unable to prove their financial history. And we've obviously spoken a lot about people having to turn to buy now, pay later solutions because of this kind of situation getting worse. And Tink findings basically confirm that this situation isn't really seeming to improve, and it's leading more and more people towards unregulated solutions. And essentially, Tink seems to be just trying to get the traditional lenders to hurry up and modernize their processes, because it found that while some people can't prove their eligibility to get a loan, some people aren't even making it past the application stage. It found that 22% of 18 to 34-year-olds abandoned a loan application and used a different lender completely because the original process that they went through was just too difficult. And when applying for a loan, 20% said they had all of the correct documents required, but still abandoned the process because they had to submit them manually. So perhaps having to print them all off and post them, which in today's day and age, I think we can all agree is just far behind what we expect as consumers. And one thing that caught my eye about this article was that it's very much related to a lot of the discussions we heard at Money Live this week, because they were all talking about, well, a lot of the panels were talking about how banks are embarking on a digital transformation journey. And one of the main goals that we heard from a lot of the different people that were there, different representatives from banks, basically explaining that they're really focused on maximizing personalization using AI, machine learning, and data to really give a more personalized experience. And that's hopefully what they're going to try and deliver in the coming years. And the Tink findings basically confirm that this is becoming increasingly popular for consumers. It found that 40% of people would let lenders digitally view their transaction data from their bank accounts to improve the application process, while 57% would prefer the option of having loans tailored to their specific financial situation. And I think that's just really interesting. I feel like it wasn't that long ago that we'd be sat here talking about how people aren't really willing to give this data away. They were a bit concerned about how this data was going to be used. But I think people are becoming more and more comfortable with the idea of, I can give my data to these different lenders and it's basically just going to save me a lot of hassle. And I kind of like the kind of way it seems to be going and different attitudes that people are having. But, do you think that open data and finance are the future? And I don't know, do you think we'll ever reach a point where we don't need to go through the whole application process? We can just say, I want this amount of loan, and you click apply, and it will instantly just say yes or no, and you'll be able to get it that way? Or do you think that's a bit of a pipe dream?
It's a really, really interesting one because I think sort of loans and credit and that kind of side of finance has always been a bit sticky, and I think we've talked about it a lot before. And then it just like generally, I think in every day when we speak about money and things, getting access to credit or getting access to loans and other things like that can actually be quite difficult unless you are quote unquote the right type of consumer. And as we've been kind of moving forward in fintech and all the different solutions and different things that are coming on with here, it is getting a lot better. But when we kind of think about sort of unbanked and underserved populations, the kind of first way we kind of think about those is purely by access to credit. And younger people and people who don't have perhaps like a big credit history, like say if you've like moved to a different country, you don't have a credit history in that country, so then it becomes a lot more difficult to access things like credit cards or loans and things like that. And it's always kind of a balancing act that comes up quite a lot in terms of, obviously you've got to balance the idea of a consumer wants to get a loan, but then the loan company has to protect itself because they don't want to be giving a loan out that they know they're not going to get back, and yada yada yada. So it's always a big mixing pot of loads of different things that you have to think about. But at the end of the day, I think it's really important to use the tools at your disposal. And I think when we've got something like open banking, open finance, whatever it's called now, why aren't we using it? Why are you having to print off bank statements and sending them off? Because I think it's been the same for a while. Like when I applied for my mortgage, I had to print off a load of documents or like save them into PDFs and send them off to my mortgage broker. And it's like, why did I have to do that? Like that just seems such a not necessarily a waste of time, but certainly like it just takes, it's very time consuming. And in a very digital age, it seems really silly when, I have an app on my phone, I have a budgeting app on my phone through open banking. It sees all my transactions and I can go in and see every single transaction that I've made in my bank account. Why can't we have that for loan applications? I think it's interesting what you're saying about a few years ago, we wouldn't have wanted that data to be shared in that way. We think of like privacy issues and privacy concerns, but I think when it comes to things like finances, it just makes sense. I guess it's you have to share that data in one way or another, whether it's printing off a bank statement or letting them access your transactions. So I don't see why we'd have an issue with it. I mean, and I do see a lot of things at the moment on like TikTok, because my TikTok is all just financial stuff, because I guess of the job that we have, everything is just financial stuff. And I see a lot of people saying like, this is what you shouldn't have in your bank statements. This is what you shouldn't, in terms of like, different transactions and things like that. And how everyone's getting savvy now that when you send your mates money for like your takeaway that you shared together, you can't put for drugs underneath it because a lender might see it and then not think it's very funny at all. So it's one of those really interesting ones, and it's all about the balancing act. But at the end of the day, if we have the technology, it surely just makes sense to use it. And if we are struggling to get people into loans, into credit, and they want to be, obviously, it's a whole different conversation in terms of like making sure people are using the right financial products for them and their situation. But if open banking, open data, and all those wonderful things can help with that, it just makes so much sense to use it, because then at the end of the day, you're matching consumers to the products that they need and the products that they can afford. And I think that's the main one. There's a lot of friction in loan applications. I think a lot of friction should be there in some aspects, because you want to make sure that everything is staying safe and that people are getting the products that they are able to pay for and not end up in an even worse situation. But if we could take away some of that friction and make things easier for consumers, it just makes complete sense to do that. And having the access to that data, to me, feels like a no-brainer. Maybe I'm oversimplifying things, but to me it just seems like, yeah, why aren't we doing that?
No, I think the same thing. I think it's, you see, like you said, like different budgeting apps where you can just give them access to your banking data, and you know, why isn't that a universal thing across finance? Why can't you just offer this press this button, here's the access to my financial data, then you can do the calculations that you need to give me the answer that I either want or don't want. But what we often hear at these events is all these sort of banking representatives, CEOs of different banks, people high up, in charge of digital transformation, basically saying like, it's going to take us this many years to get to this stage. And then you realize like they're working with such old infrastructure and like, oh, actually, before we can do that, we need to overhaul the whole system and be essentially running two different like banking systems at the same time alongside each other until our digital one's ready to really, use all this data. And you realize that everyone seems aligned in the fact that, like you said, it seems really simple. Why wouldn't you want an easier loan process or an easier process for whatever the situation is? And even the banks want the same thing, but they just are basically saying, oh, it's going to take us this many years to get to a point where we can even start to offer that. So I think it'll be interesting to see, especially over the next, who knows how long, maybe 3, 4, 5 years, of how those type of offerings do sneak more and more into different banking offerings. But yeah, as always, whenever we talk about banks, it's always just playing the waiting game and it's how long is it going to take them to catch up with what everyone wants. And I mean, I very mentioned briefly, the use of AI to try and make use of this data, and I think that's potentially going to speed things up in terms of how banks are able to process things and update their systems. And I think it's an exciting time to see what's possible in the world of finance. And I actually think that leads quite nicely onto your article, which is all about banks and AI.
Well, it does actually. That was a beautiful little segue there that I really quite enjoyed. So the reason I picked this article is because I saw that you picked this article first, and I was like, we're probably AI is going to be mentioned when we talk about your article, so it makes sense to talk about it in this aspect. So essentially, the whole piece is about how, despite a desire for generative AI, less than 1 in 10 banks have established a viable roadmap. So obviously, we've seen AI become a huge hot topic all over every sector, everywhere, basically, not just in finance. And a lot of organizations are looking at how to get involved in the space and utilize AI to make their solutions and products, and just generally, I think, their offerings and operations better. And one of the ways that we can do this, as we were just talking about, is the use of sort of data analytics within banking and having an AI there to help kind of sift through a lot of the data and things that maybe a person would do to then free up that person to do other things like maybe customer interaction and other wonderful good things like that make customers and consumers really like using your product and your solution. That's something that AI can help with. And it can kind of help with your growth as well. I think there's a research from Capgemini, a tech consulting and information firm, found that many chief experience officers plan to invest in digital technology in up to 10% to help achieve that growth. And it is that growth that I think that a lot of technologies like AI can really, really help with, because the idea is it's taking some of the workload off of people so that you can kind of keep moving together and keep working together. However, as we were just saying, a lot of banks are incredibly ill prepared to be able to enact this technology, whether that's through because their plumbing isn't quite right, they're dealing on legacy systems that just aren't ready to take on things like that. They just cannot basically take on the technology that they need in order to help their growth and help their customer satisfaction, because that's just, at the end of the day, it's all about the consumers and it's all about making your consumers happy. And if you're not offering the sort of technology and utilizing that technology in a way to do that, then you're going to have unhappy consumers, which nobody wants. No one likes that. So I think it's really interesting reading the article about how, when used responsibly, generative AI can really just make such waves within banking, within finance, and make things so much easier and simpler to use. And it can help with, risk decisioning, like we were talking about just then with your article, and just start to make things a lot more smoother for everyone involved. And yet a lot of banks just aren't doing it, and they don't even necessarily, it's not even that they can't do it, it's just they have no plans to do it. Like you're saying, everything takes so long to do, and everyone's saying, oh yeah, we'll do this in the next couple of years, keep an eye out. But some people just don't even have the roadmaps for that. They're not even to that point yet. And I wanted to talk about it because it just feels like such an interesting stance to take. And I think especially on the back of the COVID pandemic that we had a few years ago and kind of the push to digital, and everyone was talking about like chatbots and AI and how AI can be used for that. And yet we're still we haven't made that jump from utilizing AI in other ways and actually getting AI into the systems. And it just seems really interesting. And I wanted to know what you think about that. Like, do you think this is a place where banks and traditional financial service providers are really falling down, and it's where fintechs can start to really push ahead? Because I feel like, being so digitally savvy and all the other great things that young fintechs are, they can really be just agile. And a lot of fintechs are built on AI. Like, they started with AI, so they have the right plumbing in place to do that. Is this where fintech can push ahead, or do you think it's still something that a bank is going to have to try and catch up on?
Yeah, I think like we were saying, it like all the banks, the retail banks, the incumbent banks are all realizing, this is obviously where we need to be headed, and this is the technology we need to be implementing. But because of how old some of the systems they have in place are, it's not just a case of, let's just plug in AI into where we need it. They need to basically start from scratch in some cases and build around AI. And like you said, that's where the fintechs are a step ahead. And we always talk about the sort of growing success of, the different like Starlings or Monzos, these digital challenger banks that are in a situation where it's so much easier for them to implement new digital features depending on new technology that comes out because of the way that they're built and the way they're produced. And I think it means that, a lot of these banks, at Money Live, there was representatives from like Barclays and NatWest all talking about how they're sort of on this journey to get there, but it's going to take them time to get there. And in the meantime, they're just trying to play catch up as best they can and offer as features as best they can to try and match the offerings from these different fintechs. So I think one thing that we always talk about, it boils down to, is the element of trust, and these retail banks have the trust of most of the consumers. You are still even now more likely to think, oh well, I know Barclays, I know NatWest, I know HSBC, I know less people that have bank accounts with Starling or whatever, so you might still be a bit more unsure about going to one of these digital banks, even though have been around now for a considerable amount of time. I think people just still have less experience with it, therefore are more inclined to go with the retail bank. So I think ultimately in 5 years' time, it'll be interesting to see how much fintechs can actually make up in that space. They're obviously still playing catch up in terms of building that trust and building a customer base. But perhaps, if this kind of trend continues where banks struggle to really update their systems quickly, it could be a case of people getting a bit bored and thinking, well, actually, they become more and more aware of these fintechs are offering these services already, and I might have to wait 4 or 5 more years to get that if I stay where I am. So I think it's definitely an aspect that fintechs should be and already are trying to capitalize on to make sure they increase their customer base and basically just become more successful. And yeah, I think all the banks have recognized we're falling behind, but they've all, to be fair, like realized that change is needed, and they all seem to be enacting on that change, however long that's going to take. So yeah, I think it's an interesting time. We're kind of in limbo right now of everyone's talking about AI, but we're not really seeing much of it impacting immediately what is happening, especially in the world of finance. So I think it's just a case of, we know it's coming, but it might just take time. And like you said, fintechs are just in a position where they can really start to roll things out quicker. And depending on how quickly that is, might mean that they are getting more and more popular with UK customers.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting actually, that idea of, like, obviously, like, fintechs pushing ahead with banks kind of falling behind, but it feels like a conversation that we've had so many times, right? It's the same conversation we have for every topic every time about how banks are going to fall behind and fintechs are going to push ahead. But then I wonder if that's ever actually happened. I feel like over the past 5 years or so, even just the past few years, we keep saying about how banks are going to fall behind, but yet have they yet, or is that something that again we're going to see? It takes time to see that, and it's like sort of a more of a slow race that's happening, that they're only just falling behind, but then as time goes on, the gap gets further and further and further. I don't know. That's just like a really random thing that I'd be really interested to see, because we keep having this conversation.
Yeah, I think it's we do keep having this conversation. I think it's interesting that you say that, because it does seem very cut and dry even now. Like I was talking about, like black and white. You can just, it seems like the fintechs are going to really capitalize, but then we were saying that for the last 1, 2, 3, 4 years, and really we're not really seeing. I mean, we do see these challenger banks revealing, oh, we've grown by this percentage, or we're valued at this much money now. And I think Monzo have just released something yesterday saying we're worth however many millions, billions now, and it's kind of like, oh, this is our next step forward. We're still growing. So I think we are seeing it, but I think when we talk about it, we maybe expect a bigger jump from fintechs than we're ever actually going to see, and it is going to be, like you said, just a gradual process of them slowly building up their sort of abilities to catch up. And it's never quite going to be a one day we wake up and fintechs are leading the way and the retail banks are never going to catch up. So I think it's it is a slow and steady wins the race, and it might, like you said, take, who knows, 10, 15, 20 years actually to see how much of an impact this time is having, but we won't see the results of that for ages to come yet. So yeah, like you said, I think it's going to be something just to keep an eye on. And another thing we always say is just let's wait and see what happens.
It is, but I think this is like the ultimate let's wait and see what happens, because I think the proof will be in the pudding. And you're right, it won't be an overnight thing, but I think, maybe in a few years' time, however long that'll be, suddenly we'll realise, hang on a minute, the fintechs did win. So yeah, it's an interesting thought, I guess. But thank you so much anyway, Tom, for chatting about those two articles with me. That was very, very good. Again, we're just nailing it at the moment, I think, with these podcasts. But if you want to hear any more about those articles or anything else from the fintech world, head on over to thefintechtimes.com, where you can read plenty more news and insights over there. But just quickly, we will do what I learned this week. So each week, so much new news and information crosses our desks, being at the Fintech Times, that we thought we would share some with our listeners. So Tom, what have you learned this week?
Well, this week I learned through the credit management company Lowe's that 41% of people in the UK worry about their debt every single day, while around 30% currently don't know how much they owe at all. And now that I've said that out loud, I feel like that's quite a doomy and gloomy kind of stat to reveal. But that's also your daily dose of reality.
That is a bit doomy and gloomy, but mine isn't too much better, to be honest with you. With what I learned this week is that, as we were just talking about AI, that Sion believes, Sion have done a survey and found that 87% of industry experts acknowledge that tech like AI could be used to drive fraud attempts and increase fraud, which isn't fabulous. So both two dooming. Yours was more doomy and gloomy than mine, though, I will say.
Ever so slightly, yeah.
Yeah, you could enjoy that. But anyway, thank you so much again for joining me, Tom. Hopefully next time we record, we will have the whole gang back together. But anyway, it was a pleasure talking about fintech with you, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Looking forward to it. See you next week.
Thanks for listening to the Fintech Times News and Views podcast. Don't miss next week's episode, and continue the conversation using #TFT News and Views, and follow us at the Fintech Times.